Hello, everyone, and welcome to StudyTravel TV Live, a show of news, statistics, and opinion, now on a new broadcast day of Wednesday. I'm Nicola Hancox, editor of StudyTravel magazine.
Hello, everyone. I'm Matthew Knott, news editor. And before we get started, for the best viewing experience, please put the call in side-by-side speaker view. You'll see an icon in the top right corner where you can select the view.
We are delighted to welcome you all today to our first ever secondary special edition of StudyTravel TV Live. In today's broadcast, we'll start with a news story, and then we'll be joined by our guest this week, Bonnie McKie, Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Public Schools International, or CAPSI, and Lana Foster, Managing Director of Bright World Education and Guardianships.
We'll then introduce a few more stories as we go through the show, and we have a special pre-recorded interview with Zwan, Executive Director of the Schools International Education Business Association in New Zealand. If you have any questions for the presenters or guest speakers or comments on the stories, please post them in the chat box and we will read them out at the end. A big thank you to our sponsor this week, Language Cert. Okay, then let's have a look at our main story this week. And we start our secondary sector special with the main feature in the latest issue of StudyTravel magazine, an analysis of secondary enrolment statistics from the USA, Canada, UK, and Australia spanning the last 7 years. The study reveals that many of these destinations were already experiencing a trend of declining enrolments that has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic.
The most noticeable factor contributing to this trend was a decrease in Chinese students over the last 5 years. In the USA, for example, declining Chinese student numbers accounted for 65%, or 21,716 students, of the overall decrease in total international student enrolments between 2016 and 2021.
Australia has also seen a decline in Chinese students of 42% since 2017, and Canada by 13%, and the UK by 9.5%, although the Chinese market did grow for the UK until last year.
So at this point, we'd like to introduce our guests, Lana and Bonnie. Hello. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hello.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Both of you were winners in our inaugural StudyTravel Secondary School Awards earlier this year. Congratulations once again. Hope you're still buzzing from that. And it's worth mentioning at this point that voting for next year's awards will open in a couple of weeks.
Okay, so back to the story. So what factors do you think were contributing to the general decline in Chinese secondary students in these destinations? So this is a question for both of you. So let's go to you, Bonnie, first. So what do you think contributed to the general decline here?
Thanks, Nicola. I think there could be a number of factors. Certainly the growth of opportunities in other destinations, Philippines, Singapore, in China, opportunities such as international schools, 1+2, 2+1 programs, keeping students in China longer or throughout their high school education. And also, I think the Chinese, concerted effort to retain students and their intellectual capital can't be overlooked either.
Right, and same for you, Lana. How do you think that's played out here in the UK?
Well, I mean, as Matt rightly said, I mean, actually numbers from China into the UK boarding school sector, and I'm particularly interested, obviously, in numbers of students who come from China whose parents aren't resident in the UK. That was seeing an increase year on year, but actually dropped sharply last year during the pandemic by about 21%. So it's clearly pandemic related, the recent drop in China enrolments. We're hoping to see the ISC census statistics in January 22 show a recovery again for this September that's just gone.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
Bonnie, the statistics that we used in this report for Canada and a graph of which we can see on the screen now were from the 2019-2020 CAPSI report. Has the downward decline in Chinese students continued into 2020-21 from what you've seen? And are you expecting any positives from the 2020-21 statistics?
We've just finished collecting data for 2020, 2021 with membership renewal over this past summer and are just starting to collate that data now. So unfortunately, I'm not able to quantify the numbers, but unfortunately, we do expect it to show a further decline in students from China for both short and long-term programs. And of course, partly attributed to the pandemic, of course.
Are there any markets that's sort of anecdotally you think have done okay and sort of held up well in just for the coming the term that's just started now?
Yes, absolutely. Anecdotally, our members report, many of them report that their numbers of students from a number of European countries are stronger than ever.
Very good. Lana, what have your school partners told you about international student enrolments in this academic year starting just now?
Yes, I've taken the opportunity to speak to quite a few schools in preparation for today, and very positively, we've seen the general consensus is that numbers are back almost in most cases, and if not as pre-pandemic levels in UK independent schools for international students. A couple of the schools I spoke to had slight decline. They were still waiting for 1 or 2 students to arrive, largely due to visa delays. But I spoke to, for example, our colleague Justin at King Edward School Whitley, who reported that the numbers were very buoyant, and particularly from Europe, as they do the IB. They obviously didn't help that Thailand went onto the red list about 3 days before students were due to arrive here. So that obviously affected the Thai, and some of the Far East markets are not coming because of the travel restrictions. But I think generally the feeling amongst the independent boarding schools was very positive.
Excellent.
Going back to sort of the Chinese market again, do you think schools have learned a lesson from being over reliant on such a big market as China? And that's a question for you both. So Bonnie, we'll go with you first.
Absolutely. I think diversity has always been of critical importance to the success and longevity of international student programs. And I'm thinking back even to prior to China being the number one source market for international student high school programs. It was South Korea, and many of our member schools, of course, will remember weathering a sharp decline in students from South Korea, about 12, 13 years ago. So absolutely.
And same for you, Lana?
Yes, I mean, what Bonnie said exactly. You should never, in any marketing strategy, put all your eggs in one basket. But, and it must be very tempting for boarding schools to fill their boarding houses with bright, hardworking Chinese students as they are. But I think, as Bonnie said, a diverse nationality mix in schools is the way forward for everyone involved. And so, no, I think it's a good strategy to not rely on one market at all.
I think we've seen from you both that Canada and the UK seem to have suffered less severe losses in student numbers than most other secondary destinations. Well, why do you think that is, Bonnie?
Well, in addition to excellent programming, of course, certainly affordable fees and the value of the Canadian dollar have been to our advantage. And of course, I think many students, including particularly these Chinese students, think beyond their high school graduation diploma. And certainly Canada's progressive and very favorable work and immigration policies continue to keep Canada a destination of choice.
Thank you. And same for you, Lana.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just an incredible market sector that we're in, really. And over the years, since I've been in the boarding school sector, I've seen the resilience of British education. It survived SARS, Gulf Wars, hand, foot and mouth disease. We survived it through. And I think the same is, again, that people are so dead set on joining a UK boarding school to complete their education, that it's an extremely resilient sector that's again shown that it can survive even this.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. Okay, let's take another story. The essential and practical nature of guardianship services have been brought to the fore during the global pandemic. In another article in the latest issue of StudyTravel magazine, guardianship providers report that they've had to think on their feet and expect the unexpected over the last 18 months.
One of the sector's earliest tasks was organising travel for students returning home when the pandemic first hit. Other challenges included organising extended stays for those unable to travel home or for those choosing to stay in the UK longer, having to register host families as private foster carers if students were staying more than 28 days, and organising quarantine stays or camps and PCR testing.
Then, just as the summer holidays were about to commence, guardianship providers were giving another disruption when the Hong Kong government suddenly announced on June the 28th that flights from the UK would be prohibited to enter as of July the 1st.
So Lana, we'll come to you first. That must have been an extremely tense and very challenging 24 hours for guardianships organisations as you try to book students returning to Hong Kong on earlier flights. So can you talk us through it?
I think my mind had sort of blotted that out. I'm having flashbacks. I'd almost forgotten that had happened. I think the everyone at Brightworld now deserves a doctorate in change and crisis management. And I think by the 28th of June, it was just another curveball. Hey ho, let's deal with this one. And they did. I mean, the phone, it was mad. We had about 48 hours to get however many students, back to Hong Kong, as did every other guardianship organisation. The phone rang off the hook day and night. Parents were able to book flights. We then had to get them PCR tests to get onto the flight and all sorts of different, very complicated paperwork. And it was, very challenging, but they all, bar a few who got stranded, a few missed the boat, unfortunately. That most of them got back. There was a crisis moment where flights were booked, but there were no quarantine places in Hong Kong. So that was another curveball. And then suddenly some beds were released by the Hong Kong government. Another hotel was granted. So it was a really fraught time.
We've just started the 2021-22 academic year. So how has that been? Have there been any particular challenges in getting students into the country and onto campus? Bonnie, let's start with you.
We've experienced the same constantly changing landscape in terms of quarantine, pre-arrival, post-arrival testing, some new very welcome exemptions for those students who qualify as fully vaccinated coming into Canada, but trying to, of course, stay on top of what those are, and then the students' experience at the airport. Unfortunately, some students did experience some lengthy delays as, of course, our CBSA border officers also started to learn and navigate all of these new requirements at what is always a very peak time at the end of August, early September. This sort of on top of a shortfall of host families most recently, in some cases no longer feeling comfortable to host, or in some cases, of course, because their own children who may be post-secondary students that would typically go away to study were now learning online. They chose to stay home and now no longer have a spare bedroom to host an international student. So, minor complications, of course, here and there, all add up to some confusion and chaos on days, but certainly we are through that, and students are settled, and our programs over the last 19 months have certainly learned very well to manage and support these students and keep them engaged while they're, for those that are required to complete quarantine, while they're fulfilling that 14-day requirement. So all in all, it went much more smoothly this September, I think, and we continue to learn and adapt day by day, week by week.
Thank you. And how about you, Lana? You've mentioned a small blip with Thailand there just before the start of term, but
yes.
But generally, how were things for this term?
The Thailand was a sort of reverse Hong Kong, where they had to get here by the 1st of September. So all of a sudden they booked early flights, and most of ours did actually get here. Our arrivals, as Bonnie said, they went a lot more smoothly than they did last year. It really helped that there was a quarantine exemption granted for under 18-year-olds who are at boarding schools. That took a lot of extra work away from us. And they're all here. They've all been visited, and it's the first EXIAC weekend tomorrow. So we're underway.
Very good.
Right. Now, many in the sector feel the pandemic has perhaps helped highlight the benefits of using a designated guardianship provider. Is that fair to say, Lana? And have inquiries already risen as a consequence, do you think?
Yeah, they have. I mean, guardianship years ago was a bit of a dirty word, an extra expense that, people had to fork out when they booked their boarding school education. I think, now, particularly in Europe, in markets where it wasn't deemed necessary to have a guardian because they could nip home for the EXIACs and half terms, or parents could get here quickly if there was an emergency. All that obviously during the pandemic wasn't possible. And I think both schools and parents and agents overseas have seen the benefit of working with a professional guardianship organisation whose job it is to sort things out when things go wrong, and in emergency situations, which don't just happen during pandemics, they happen in normal times as well. So I think schools that I've spoken to are really appreciative of the guardianship sector, particularly the Aegis accredited guardians who are doing stuff properly and have processes in place. So our inquiries are definitely hugely up for next year and have been a very healthy lot of interest in our programs.
Great.
Bonnie, I'm sure homestay providers and families in Canada and schools and school boards can sort of sympathise with this and face their own challenges during the pandemic. What have been some of the major hurdles that you've overcome during this time?
Yes, much the same as Lana's indicated, of course. Immediately, it was the necessity to help facilitate the safe return of students, and then of course supporting students and keeping them engaged last summer when many chose not to return home. Of course, we did have our borders reopened last October 2020, and of course trying to navigate the quarantine, which was new to everyone at that point, and then of course layer on that, testing, pre-arrival, post-arrival testing, now exemptions for vaccinations. It certainly kept all of our members busy, and certainly there's been a loss of host families over the last year for a large number of reasons, some of which I've already spoken about. So staying on top of that, and now we have many host families that are only willing to host students that are fully vaccinated. So having to navigate those conversations and see where that takes us will be interesting.
Okay.
Okay, let's take another story. The Schools International Education Business Association, or SIEBA, the peak body representing the secondary school sector in New Zealand, has released a sector recovery report aimed at guiding schools to formulate strategic plans for when borders reopen.
The report broadly outlines 3 scenarios of return, rethink, and reimagine, and outlines steps for schools to consider in areas such as student experience, international operations, marketing and recruitment, sustainability, people, risk management, and partnerships.
A major part of the report is aimed at ensuring that schools increase digital capacity, and the association sets out steps of how schools can engage and support agents through enhancement of their digital marketing and remote recruitment.
So earlier this week, I interviewed John Zwan, Executive Director of SIEBA. And firstly, I asked him what they hoped to achieve with the report.
For us, that report really serves as a resource to help schools think about recovery in a strategic way. It offers a scenario-based approach and says to schools, well, we do have some time. Now's the time to be doing some strategic planning and thinking about recovery. And you've essentially got 3 options that we're putting forward. One is to just return, go back to the way things were, to kind of rethink your program, to do a little bit of a review and improve on the things that you think you need to improve on. But then there's also an opportunity to kind of reimagine how you're approaching international education in your school. And so the report offers a bit of a framework for schools to work through a process to come to where they are in terms of recovery and where they fit on that continuum of just kind of going back to the way things were, to actually doing a bit of a reimagining. And we're kind of hoping that most will fall in the reimagine area, or look to innovate and to do things quite differently, which I think we know that COVID has changed a lot, and so I think innovation is going to be a key to recovery. So that's what we're hoping from this report.
Okay, excellent. And I mean, what do you think that the sector will need to sort of assist recovery when the borders do reopen, hopefully early next year?
Yeah, look, I think we're, we think a digital approach to both recruitment, marketing, and how schools manage international enrolments is key. I think we all appreciate that there's not going to be as much travel for quite some time. So looking to online approaches to connect with the agent network, to connect with families, is going to be critical for schools in the future. And we think that's a key area. But I think it comes down to effective planning and actually thinking ahead and starting that now, rather than kind of waiting until students come back and then deciding what you're going to do. So it's a combination of effective planning now and with a particular focus on digital technologies to support.
And in terms of the borders reopening, what do you have any insights or expectations when secondary school students where they might be in the queue when things start to open up?
Yeah, look, we've been asking the government that question on a regular basis, and still uncertainty is the main kind of reply we get. But we are hopeful that the government released a plan a few weeks ago around how New Zealand can reconnect to the rest of the world, and that kind of plan hinges on an effective vaccine rollout. We're getting there. The latest kind of Delta outbreak has spurred a lot of people on to get vaccinated. So, we're hopeful that by the end of this year, we will have, significantly high numbers of Kiwis vaccinated. That will mean that the government can relax our current border restrictions, and if that can happen, then we're expecting to be able to see some school students come in kind of mid to late next year. Our government has made clear that they're not prepared for young school students to go into managed isolation as it is now. So we're hopeful that if we can get everybody vaccinated and we can get a relax to the border, then we might see school students beginning to come in mid to late next year.
Thank you so much to John for taking the time to do that interview with us. A full version of that is on the StudyTravel network now on both the news page and the StudyTravel TV live page. And we go on to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on student recruitment and staff employment, and the importance of agents.
So, Bonnie, in this report, SIEBA highlight that the pandemic and New Zealand's closed borders have given an opportunity for a rethink and a reset of how schools work and why they engage in international education. Canada's borders didn't close quite as long, but did similar conversations take place in the sector there? And if so, what kind of ideas came forward?
Thanks, Nicola. Yes, absolutely. Certainly, our borders were closed for only about 7 months. However, 19 months later, we still have a federal government directive that indicates we should avoid all non-essential travel. So certainly our association and our members have been forced to think differently and to work differently in terms of making new agent connections and how we continue to nurture those that are already established abroad. So we shifted all of our trade mission events to a virtual format. Of course, we've participated in many industry agent conferences and workshops in a virtual format over the last year. And we do our planning on a 3-year cycle. So 2021 happens to be a strategic planning year for us anyway. So we will be embarking on a similar type of process, firstly with our board members next month, and then moving forward to engage our membership as well.
Okay.
And Lana, agents are very much integral to the recruitment scenarios in this report from SIEBA. We've talked about with you about guardianships becoming more important. Would you say that agencies will also become even more important in the recruitment process for secondary schools?
I mean, I just can't imagine personally life without agents. I've worked with them for my entire career, and I've always depended heavily on their support and their expertise. So they've always been absolutely vital, in my opinion, and I think in a lot of schools' opinions as well. During COVID, it's been even more amplified because you know, having a professional agent between school, parent, guardianship organisation, helping to manage changes, very, very panicky situations and panicking parents. There's a calm person in between who's used to this sort of thing, translating, you know, the complex rules and guidance that comes in, that we're able to sort of make sense of, but they've then got to translate it to parents. So acting as a conduit is vital. And, you know, when you've got true partnerships with agents, it also makes working life just much more enjoyable and easier.
It does. Thank you. So let's take another story. The US State Department has confirmed that in-person interviews may be waived for some international students applying for F1, M1 and academic J1 visas until the end of the year.
Applicants from anywhere who have previously applied for and received any visa for the USA may be considered for interview waivers by consular officers, whilst first-time applicants in the 39 countries in the US visa waiver program may also be considered.
International education associations in the US have been calling for measures to deal with the visa backlog, and recently a group of US Democrat senators wrote to the department urging action on the issue.
So Bonnie, Canada has had its own issues with visa backlogs over recent months, so I gather. How are things there currently? And did the two-stage study permit process that Immigration to Refugees and Citizenship Canada introduced during the pandemic, did that help at all?
Yes, the stage 2 processing in 2020 did seem to help, and certainly IRCC's spring commitment to have any applications that were received by May 15th processed by August 6th was a welcome commitment. Of course, it was challenging for some students to complete their biometrics on time. You know, we had relatively short notice. I believe this was announced in early May, and of course the deadline was May 15th. So there wasn't a lot of time, of course, for people to comply, and unless their applications were essentially complete and they happened to already have biometric appointments before May 15th. So that was a struggle for some. For the most part, students that were destined for our K-12 schools did receive study permit approvals in time. We do still have some students who didn't apply perhaps on time, that applied later in June or July, that are still waiting for approvals. And in some cases, those students are being supported online by our member schools. In other cases, they've had to defer either to the second quarter or the second semester of the school year, depending on how their school year is structured.
And Lana, has the UK made any concessions in terms of visas for students in the independent school sector? And how beneficial have these been?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of flexibility during the pandemic around visa extensions, people overstaying, you know, when they couldn't get home to extend their visa. And then, of course, not really pandemic related, but more recently, the news that any student can spend 6 months in a boarding school on a visitor visa, which has opened the windows for a lot of new types of students coming over.
It's been a welcome measure then.
Very welcome, yes.
Very good. Okay, let's have a look at another story. The government of South Australia has been approved to extend the Year 11 and 12 COVID-19 travel exemption program to include 16 and 17-year-olds. Previously, only 18-year-old students could apply for the exemption. To be eligible, 16 and 17-year-old students must travel and quarantine with a guardian.
The Department for Education, Study Adelaide and schools have been working with agents to see if any students may be eligible for the scheme and keen to apply for an exemption.
Mercedes College, an independent school in South Australia, told StudyTravel magazine that it was in consultation with agents and parents in several countries, and that generally the agency reaction to this news has been positive and keen.
And we know that Australia has been a closed shop for international students, so it is interesting that this concession scheme applies to the high school sector. We've talked a lot with language sector guests recently about how they feel the sector has been a little roughly treated, shall we say. But how would you say the secondary school sector, or at least the international facing element of it, has been treated by your respective governments? So we'll go to you, Bonnie, first.
I think we've been fortunate in Canada that the secondary school sector has been treated as equally as all of the other sectors, language and post-secondary, in terms of reopening and immigration policies. Certainly communication has been key in terms of our advocacy efforts and reopening and planning to ensure that students could safely and responsibly do so.
And for you, Lana, how's it been in the UK?
Well, since August, there were some exemptions made for children who are arriving. I think it was largely instigated because of the travel market, so that tourist market for the UK people. But that was great because we then got it agreed or validated by the DfE that this would apply to under 18 boarding school students or students who are on child and student visas, that they could, if they weren't traveling from a red country, could come over and they wouldn't have to quarantine. So that's great. And then the news just literally this week, which is great, is that those travel regulations are being further simplified. So there'll only be a red list of countries, and all the rest of the world will be exempt from quarantining on arrival if they're under 18 or they're fully vaccinated. And also the great news on that is that there's a list of approved vaccinations that aren't just UK, Europe and USA. So it reaches to 51 different countries. So things are really becoming a lot easier. And although that later guidance that's only just come through now didn't help the arrivals, it will help students who would like to go home for half term, for example, or parents that would like to come and visit and see their children, and obviously the Christmas break may be easier. And the testing requirements are being made a lot easier as well. They won't have to do a PCR test before they come, and they'll only have to do a day 2 test on arrival.
Okay.
Good news.
Indeed. This scheme for South Australia will probably only attract a relatively small number of students, given the restrictions on it. But do you think that small window of possibility is important for agents and students to keep the flame alive? Bonnie, for example, how did CAPSI members keep their clients engaged during that period when Canada was closed?
Absolutely. I think a small window of opportunity and hope will be important for Australia in both the short and long term. For us, really communicating with our members, with agent partners, agent associations abroad, and certainly in turn the students and parents about the advocacy efforts, the strategies that we were putting in place to try and get the borders to reopen, and then beyond that, about all the planning and collaboration with our members and stakeholders around the plans that were being put so that students could safely and responsibly enter Canada and be supported through that quarantine requirement. And as of course the situation has changed with respect to testing and vaccinations and exemptions and that type of thing, of course, just still communication being number one, and always being ready and willing to explain and re-explain and re-explain what it means, and to be available has been key for all of us.
A lot of explaining going on. Yeah. Okay, we'll take one last story, and as Lana's just explained to us a little bit, the UK Department for Transport has announced a new international travel system for England to be implemented from October the 4th, when the green and amber lists will be scrapped and arrivals will be categorised as red list or rest of the world.
The list of countries that the government recognises for vaccinated travel has been expanded to include 17 more countries, including Japan, Malaysia, South Korea and Taiwan. As a result, fully vaccinated passengers and under 18s from these countries will be able to enter without quarantine and will have reduced testing requirements.
And as Lana's just explained, an important clarification is that under 18s with student visas from any non-red list countries will be considered as UK residents and therefore won't need to isolate. So Lana, this means that several of, as you've already sort of said, really, several of the top markets in Europe and Asia, students can now come from those without any isolation. A little bit late for the academic year, but presumably the sector welcomes these measures.
Oh, definitely, yes. And the only problem is it's great for arrivals. It's a lot easier for students to get here. It's less costly. They don't have to have the PCR test prior departure. And at the end of October, apparently, we haven't got a date yet, but they'll only have to take a lateral flow test on day 2. So that will save money and time. The problem is it's still very difficult to get away and home again. So, for example, there are no direct flights to China still. And with Hong Kong, you have to quarantine in a government hotel for 21 days when you go back. So although it's encouraging arrivals, it's whether or not they're stuck here for Christmas. And that's the question on our minds at the moment, and whether or not they'll all be here at Christmas time. But it's generally very, very good news, and is allowing a lot of markets who don't have such restrictions on traveling between their country and ours now to just go home for half term, see mum and dad, and not worry about being stranded here and quarantining on the way back. So it's really great news.
And Bonnie, what is the situation with regards to quarantine requirements now for young learners coming to Canada?
Canada hasn't moved to a list of countries approach. Essentially, they've indicated that if you are fully vaccinated with one of the 4 vaccines currently approved for use in Canada, which would be Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, then students can simply be required to have a negative PCR test prior to 72 hours prior to arrival, and then could be exempted from the quarantine and testing requirements upon arrival. However, it is ultimately the border officer upon arrival that has ultimate decision making in that. Having said that, there aren't any specific concessions for minor students under this scheme. It applies to everybody the same, all inbound travelers.
Okay, thank you. Well, that brings us up to date with all the news and goings on in the industry. At this point, we'll completely open up to the audience to see if there are any questions for our guests or for the StudyTravel team. These can be on any of the stories or topics we've discussed, and do please make sure that your name and your organization are in the Zoom name or in the question that you put there. Just while we wait for a question or two to pop in there, I've got one here with regards to events. In the last week, StudyTravel has announced a series of Alfie in-person plus events, including 2 dedicated conferences for the secondary sector. So are you looking forward to getting back to face-to-face events? Lana?
Oh, absolutely. I can't wait. I'm zoomed out.
Very much so.
But Bonnie, are you actually allowed to sort of travel for events at the moment, or is that still?
No, not while we have this federal government avoid all non-essential travel directive. We tentatively have some in-person events planned to be held abroad in the spring, and we're hopeful that we'll be able to execute those. But of course, that remains to be seen at this point.
Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed, yeah. And if we wait to see if there's any other questions, we do have another one. From what you have observed from this current academic year, which markets seem the most keen and able to travel for secondary studies abroad? And let's go to Bonnie first.
Again, by all accounts, and this is just anecdotal at this point, certainly our members are looking to Europe as those students that have been most ready and willing to travel to date. many reporting, of course, that their European numbers are higher than ever for the September enrollment. And we remain optimistic, of course, that some of our Asian and other key markets will recover for second semester and beyond.
Is that a similar case for the UK, Lana? Are European numbers perhaps more up than they have been?
I think so, because of the ease of travel, and it's the sort of South American, Malaysia it's struggling because of their travel restrictions, and Thailand because they're on the red list. Those markets are pandemic related sort of drop-offs. But yes, I agree with Bonnie that Europe is definitely buoyant.
Okay, just see give it any more questions coming through. Can't see, they're being shy. So in that case, that looks like the end of our Q&A, which brings us to the end of this week's StudyTravel TV Live. We hope everybody enjoyed it. If you'd like to come along to the next one on October the 6th, visit the StudyTravel TV Live page on the StudyTravel Network, which you can find under the magazine section in the menu.
We'll be announcing the guest speakers for the next broadcast on this page, and you can also find the recording of this episode and past episodes in the listing at the bottom.
Finally, we'd like to say a big thank you to our special guests. Bonnie, thank you for your time. Early morning start for you, so really appreciate you joining us and giving those insights today. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And Lana, thank you once again. We look forward to seeing you in person sometime soon.
Yeah, I can't wait. Thank you very much.
And thank you once again to our sponsor this week, Language Cert. And thank you to everyone for watching. Goodbye.
Goodbye.